Welcome to the GreenPilled.network podcast. If you're just joining us, we are building a coordination and network state of thousands of hackers, dreamers, and doers focused on using crypto to bring positive-sum digital systems to the world. This podcast features the people who are doing it and is published every Tuesday and Thursday. If you want to learn more, visit our website at GreenPilled.network, where you can download the GreenPilled book for free or join the Discord or become a member of your local GreenPilled.network chapter. My guest today is Kain Warwick. Kain is the founder of Synthetix, a DeFi protocol that acts as the liquidity layer for an ecosystem of on-chain derivatives and financial instruments. Synthetix is a decentralized liquidity layer that's available on Ethereum and Optimism and has a total value staked at $512 million. Kain is a DeFi OG who helped to pioneer yield farming during the 2020 DeFi summer, and he decentralized himself from Synthetix in 2020 to a council that makes decisions. So the primary arc of this episode is talking about Kain's relationship to Synthetix DAO and the numerous times that he has decentralized himself, let it go a little bit, and re-centralized himself. And this episode is aimed primarily at founders and developers that want to progressively decentralize their projects, but aren't sure about the practical realities of doing so. So we need to escape the echo chamber of Twitter, where you have people who are just decentralization maxis and don't understand the nuance of what it's like to actually be in the trenches and to decentralize yourself away from a protocol, but also the reasons why you might want to centralize yourself back to a protocol or a DAO that needs the help that only a founder can provide. So basically, Kain has decentralized himself from Synthetix and then re-centralized a couple of times. The first was in 2021, in which he came back to help deal with some of the uncertainty that people at the governance layer at Synthetix were feeling. The second time, he came back to work on a number of product-related things, Drift and Vision on the product layer of the DAO. And this third and most recent time, Kain has returned to focus on moonshots evolving in the Synthetix ecosystem and a product called Infinix that he is helping to build. So in this episode, we talk about the yo-yo between decentralization and centralization as you, as a founder of a DeFi or DAO protocol, need to go through in order to go on a route of progressive decentralization, but also progressively more success in market. And we talk about some of the nuance that happens, the things that the nuance that happens there, the things that only a founder can bring back to a DAO are that they care a lot, or that they have context, or that they have domain expertise, and the onus is on them as the people who have those things to come back and provide value to the project if they can, or the onus at least that Kain felt with respect to Synthetix. But also, returning doesn't mean that you're the founder and CEO anymore. It just means that you're a contributor that also is checked by governance and you don't have unilateral control. So what are the ways in which founders returning to projects that they've decentralized can add value to those ecosystems is the subject of this episode. And I just think, wow, Kain is such a legend in the ecosystem. And the fact that I got him to talk about this on the Green Pill is I think, a real public good for founders out there that might be struggling with the loneliness of these questions, or the question of how to progressively decentralize from their projects, and then when to return and be a little bit more hands-on if things are going off the cliff after they have decentralized. So we really get into the nuance of that playbook of progressive decentralization for founders on this episode. And that is why I'm really excited for this episode with Kain Warwick. And I think you're going to enjoy it too.
ValleyDAO is an open global collective working to finance and democratize the governance of synthetic biology technologies to protect the future of our planet. Research and progress into synthetic biology is critically constrained by the world of nation-state regulations and bureaucracy from middlemen. But the potential that synthetic biology has for the world is massive. It can produce a world in total harmony with nature. We can grow stuff using cells like software. It's awesome. And the best part is we no longer have to pull carbon out of the ground to grow and maintain civilization. Don't you think we should be funding this? ValleyDAO does, and that's what they're here to do, to try and make the SolarPunk world of tomorrow a reality today. So join ValleyDAO right now and save the planet at valleydao.bio.
Hey, Kain, what's up? How you doing?
Hey, Kevin. Good to see you again.
Yeah, likewise. Really excited to talk about your involvement with Synthetix as a founder who has decentralized himself and then returned, I think once or maybe twice now. So could you give us the broad strokes of that story to tee us off?
Yeah. So, I got to a point, I think it was probably around like 2020, where we had decentralized a bunch of things. We had shut down our entities. So we no longer had like an open source software foundation that I was running. And it was sort of a question of like, okay, what does this council that's running the protocol look like? And when we first launched the council, there was a pretty clear kind of suggestion from most of the people running for the council that they didn't want me on the council. They wanted some space to kind of establish it and see how it went. And so for about 6 months, I wasn't on the council. I was just an interested party that was kind of working in the background, doing stuff. But the council, was kind of making all the decisions. And after about 6 months, I was like, okay, this is cool. It's worked pretty well, but there's some gaps. And I think the main gap is like the sync between the contributors who are, on the ground doing the work and the council who was making the decisions about, what should go into the protocol. And that kind of communication was just breaking down. And so I said, okay, why don't I run for council and see how that goes? And so I did. I came back, I ran for the council. I hadn't really been gone per se. I just hadn't been making decisions. So I came back to kind of help make decisions and coordinate that. And I think after about 6 months, it went pretty well. And then I stepped back again. And then I came back another time because I thought there were different issues. And now, having stepped back a second time, I've come back a third time, not into Synthetix proper, but to actually build a new front end for Synthetix, which is called Synthetix. So this is a different role altogether. I'm no longer making decisions in Synthetix. I'm trying to kind of contribute as like an outside party.
Seems like you've got quite a yo-yo relationship with the Synthetix project, which I can certainly relate to as a founder of a DAO as well. I'm wondering, in the times in which you've been yo-yoing out, decentralizing, what has motivated you? Like, why does decentralization matter to you, and why has that? What the Zuckerberg thing would be to like make this an empire and to make yourself the king of it forever. Why decentralize? Why not go down that route?
Yeah, I think you and I are probably pretty aligned on this, right? That this idea that a group of people who are incentivized correctly with like the right incentives are going to make better decisions, or at least different decisions, right? Than a benevolent dictator, right, or a CEO or whatever. And so for me, this idea that you want groups of people that are going to be involved and be able to participate is really powerful. But then there's this trade-off, and you and I have spoken about this as well, where there might be insufficient motivation for all of these people to kind of come together, and that a founder has this like deep connection to a project that maybe other people might not have, right, and is going to really push things further than some independent person acting in the system. And so I think for me, it was kind of like trying to find that balance, right, of like, we want good decision making. We don't want unilateral control by a single person or even like a small group of people. We want this to be an open thing that anyone can participate in. But we also, want to make sure that everyone's motivated and incentivized to do stuff, because otherwise you just get apathy and things kind of fade away. And balancing those two things is I think been the challenge.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, let's go back to this post that Vitalik wrote about why DAOs are not just on-chain organizations. And in that post, Vitalik talks about decentralization providing credible neutrality, decentralization providing censorship resistance, and then if you have better decision-making in a democratic environment, decentralization will allow you to capture that. And I think I heard a smattering of each of those things in what you said. Synthetix as a protocol needs to be credibly neutral and censorship resistant, and also the more democratic decision-making that comes from having a decentralized group of actors making decisions. In your case, the council and the governance is better than having like a top-down person making all of the decisions. So those are things that I heard in your answer there.
Yeah, for sure. And, I'm very much in agreement around credible neutrality. I think, people are biased, right? Like, it's unavoidable. And so if you have, one person or a small group of people making decisions, those biases are going to creep in. It's pretty unavoidable. Obviously, humans collectively have biases, but, it's probably not going to be as stark, I think, if you've got this open governance mechanism where anyone can come in and, it becomes like a marketplace of ideas and people can really discuss things and, kind of get the crux of it. It does go slower, but you make fewer bad decisions, I would say.
Decentralization is credibly neutral. You get more voices on the table. They might have biases, but at least they're out on the table, and there's a marketplace of ideas where people can evolve it forward. But then in the times that you're kind of yo-yoing back in centralization, it's because something isn't working. People aren't synthesizing the information across the different. Well, I guess it's changed as Synthetix has evolved between your first time coming back and your second and your third. But I'm wondering if you could maybe speak to when you came back, what were the motivations the first, second, and third time?
Yeah, so I think a person who has been deeply involved in a project since its very beginning has a level of context and understanding of that thing that really probably exceeds anyone else, right? There were, I would say, within the early Synthetix community, probably like 4 or 5 people that had a better understanding of Synthetix than myself, right? Like they just deeply cared about it and really thought about specific aspects or whatever. But even those people who really understood Synthetix and why it operated the way that it was were probably missing context, having not been around in the early days. Like, why did we make certain decisions, path dependency, et cetera? And so having that context and having that expertise, domain expertise, if you will, right? I felt like there was an onus on me as one of the few people that was in a position to sort of leverage that domain expertise to get the right outcome as I saw it, right? Obviously, the outcome still needed to go through governance, right? I still needed to convince people this was the right call. But there's just a level of efficiency that I think an individual can kind of apply when they really see a problem and a solution and come in and kind of rally everyone around that solution and say, hey, everyone, this is what's going on. Like, let's fix this, right? And that doesn't mean unilateral control. It doesn't mean you get to come in and say, we're doing this because I said so. You still need to convince everyone, and it's still, a democratic process. But I do think that there's an efficiency in having like a single person who really understands the problem and the solution and can convince people and come up with a narrative and really drive it.
So what I heard there was like, as the founder and just someone who's been involved with Synthetix for half a decade now, you care a lot, you have context, you have domain expertise, and that kind of created a feeling of an onus on you as one of the few people who had these things to come back and right any things that were not going wrong or that were going wrong with the project. And there's a certain efficiency that comes with that all being in your mind, but you're still as Synthetix has decentralized, you're no longer the CEO and founder of a monolithic entity. So the outcome has to go through governance and you don't have unilateral control there. So there's like a check on your power, quote unquote, there as you're returning.
Exactly. Yeah. And, what my vision was in the first instance evolved over time, right? Through that process of convincing people. People had reasonable feedback and concerns about what I was proposing. And, the ultimate solution ended up kind of evolving into something that was slightly different to what I had in mind. But I think that process was a powerful process. And again, just the motivation coming from like, someone needs to do this. I see a problem, right? Like, and I think everyone saw the problem. Like it wasn't like people, I didn't turn up and say, hey guys, there's this issue here. And everyone's like, whoa, what are you talking about? Everyone's like, yeah, no, we get it. It's just no one really was sufficiently motivated to kind of fix it or had the right incentives or whatever.
But did the problems get smaller as you went from the first, second, and third times returning? Like, it seems like as the network has gotten more successful and more decentralized, it would be obvious that the problems that you're solving are different in each time you return.
Yeah, I think so. The first problem was like the people making decisions are not communicating with the people doing things. Like that's pretty fundamental, bro. That just is not going to work very well, right? And what happened was there was a pretty clear roadmap for the people doing things, the contributors, and as that roadmap sort of wrapped up, the uncertainty around what to do next just really kind of grew massively. And so like over the course of 6 months, it was like, okay, we've done this and this and this and this and this, and now we're kind of sitting here like, what do we do next? And the decision makers were like, I don't know. And they were like, all right, well, so what's happening? And so they needed to be kind of brought together to really kind of make some decisions about like, what was needed.
You're almost like also communing the people to get them to understand each other, both socially and okay.
Yeah. And I think, the role of a founder or, important critical people in a project, in my mind, is about synthesizing information, right? A startup is hard enough, right? But like a DAO or a decentralized organization or crypto project, there's so many different threads and bits of information. The role of, critical people within that, community is to come in and take all those pieces and put it together in something that people can understand. Because the average person doesn't have time to do that themselves. It's like they don't have time to go and read 100 blog posts and every Discord message and put it all together themselves. They need someone to put it together for them, write a blog post and say, here's our problems, here's our potential solutions, here's how we think about things, here's why we think about them this way. And kind of, in 20 minutes, they can be brought up to speed, right? To a reasonable extent. And someone needs to do that. And there was no one in the ecosystem or in the community that was doing that. And so I was like, all right, I'll put my hand up.
Put your hand up and be the synthesizer.
Yeah.
The network.
Synthetix. Yeah, exactly.
So the first time you returned, it was because people making the decisions were not communicating with the operators, and that was creating uncertainty. And so you brought those people together. And what were the second and third returns? Like, what problems were you trying to solve during this?
Yeah, so I stepped back again after a little while, and I came back because I thought that there were a number of like product related things that were important and maybe not being addressed, and it was kind of small things, but I just felt like there was a little bit of drift in the vision, right? It was a similar thing, like there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. People trying a bunch of things. There's a bunch of experimentation, but we really need to come in and kind of make some decisions and force the issue and decide how are we going to approach these things, how are we going to move forward. And so that was kind of the second time that I came back to run for the council. And then the third time, this most recent time, coming back on the treasury and building Synthetix was about, okay, we need to. So I think what happens is, the more weird ideas, the kind of more outside the box thinking, it's hard to get people to do that from like inside the project, right? Someone needs to be mandated to like be like, hang on a second, let's just really rethink like, what are we trying to do here? Is this actually the optimal way? And I think that oftentimes from within the project, if you're a contributor or a community member, it can be quite easy to just kind of keep going with the momentum, keep going in the same direction, and to just, say, hang on everyone, stop everything. Let's think, is this the right path and should we go somewhere else? That's a hard thing for someone to do unless they've got like a level of sort of cut through and cachet or whatever within the project to be able to like tell everyone to stop and rethink things. So I think that was needed. And, with respect to the treasury, that was, kind of my pitch was like, let's come in and really think about what is this treasury doing? Why are we doing things this way? What are we trying to achieve? Where do we want to go? And we came up with like 11 different ideas of things that we could test, things that we could do with the treasury that would, potentially push the project forward. Obviously only 2 or 3 of them in the course of 3 months were we able to kind of get moving, but, there's still a backlog of things that we can try. And then with Synthetix, it was like, okay, guys, we've actually built the thing. It works now. Like this is on some level done, right? We've got an execution engine that competes with centralized exchanges. How do we make sure that people are using it? Like ultimately for the last, 7 years of smart contract engineering or whatever it is, right? Since Ethereum, was live, has been about trying to build stuff that works. And, we've had bits and pieces of things that have worked and are kind of accessible to people. But it's only probably been in the last 2 or 3 years, I think we really got some traction and can really compete with the database. Right? Like that's ultimately what we're trying to do, right? The world's run by databases and blockchains are a better way of coordinating and, more open and all of the beneficial things that come from, running things on a blockchain, using smart contracts. But they have massive trade-offs. And so the idea was like, come in and try and smooth some of those trade-offs and show people this tech is better. This is better than a database, right? We're not going to rug you. We can't rug you. But it's going to be easy to use, right? Because you can have something that is amazing and safe and whatever, but if it's unusable for the average person, it's never going to get traction.
So what I heard there was that you've kind of returned to Synthetix. You've been yo-yoing with Synthetix in 3 sort of rotations. The first was about helping the people making decisions communicate with the operator and resolving that uncertainty with the operators and resolving that uncertainty. The second time, it was because there was a number of product-related things adrift in vision. And then the third time with this treasury, the treasury work that you're doing now, you're trying to encourage more weird ideas, more outside of the box thinking. You've kind of gone up the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like governance is working, product is working. What are the moonshot bets that we could do, and really accelerate what's already working? And what I heard that I thought was interesting there is that you have a certain amount of cachet in the project that you can go against the grain of the way things already work, and that's something that you could only do as a founder or someone with the amount of cachet to get there. So did I play back the three returns?
Yeah, I think that's kind of it, you know. And I think like my sense is that this is something that, you know, organizations, like, I don't think this is unique to Synthetix by any stretch, right? Like, I think that this is something that, you know, we've seen play out in other DAOs, Maker, for example, right? You know, where Rune's kind of said, okay, run free, right? And then he's like, you're running off a cliff, and he comes back and he's like, don't run, you know. And you might agree or disagree with like whether they were actually running off a cliff and whether, you know, now he's like got them in the right direction or what. But, you know, there is the power that a founder has to be able to come and really kind of rally everyone to like a vision and say like, actually, let's try and do this, right? And so, you know, whether or not you agree or disagree with you know, the conclusion, right? Like, there is a sense that, you know, having this really diffuse responsibility of all of these different people can lead to like just a kind of slowing down and you know, not motivated to really push things forward or do crazy things, come up with crazy ideas.
Yeah. I mean, I think being slow and immutable is a feature at like the foundation of things that need to be credibly neutral. But like the innovation in the labs side of things, you almost get this like tragedy of the commons where you're not innovating. In some cases, the product isn't even working anymore. So like separating the concerns of what are the things that actually need to be decentralized, credibly neutral, and slow and hard from the things where you actually need the people to be motivated is something I'm starting to see across all these different ecosystems that have that as they expand from one monolithic project into many modular projects. You're going to have your parts that are credibly neutral, and you're going to have your parts that are more political and opinionated. And that's just sort of, it's almost like the Big Bang creating solar systems and universes. Like some of them, they're just different from each other.
Yeah, agreed. And this is, you know, I wrote about this in like 2019 or whatever, right? This idea that like people were so caught up, you know, the people who were still around in 2019 were, you know, diehard decentralization maximalists, right? Like, you know, especially in the Ethereum ecosystem, like people, you know, the vast majority of people in my mind were really focused on that. And so Synthetix, as one of the few projects that kind of survived 2018, there were a lot of skeptics, right? They were like, but wait, you're not immutable. You're not doing, you know, like, look at Augur. Like Augur is like immutable, you know, whatever, right? Like you look at, you know, these projects like that had really gone out and you know, tried to do everything immutably as possible. And I just said, Synthetix doesn't matter right now. Like it just doesn't. It's not important. So we can be not decentralized right now. Like I'm not saying let's make Ethereum less decentralized, right? Like I'm not saying, you know, let's try and centralize everything if that's a better idea. I'm just saying that the things that don't matter right now, let's experiment and move quickly. And if they actually become important, then let's decentralize. Which was a fairly, you know, novel idea, I think, back then. But I think people, you know, and there's a problem with that, of course, which is that like people go, sure, you're going to decentralize it over time. Like, sure, you know, you're just going to get it important, and then you're going to be the dictator of it and not ever let anyone touch it, right?
You're going to Zuckerberg it, yeah.
Yeah, and like, you know, it's hard sitting in 2019 to be like, no, I'm really serious about this. I want to do this, you know.
Yeah.
And even every time I've come back, people have been like, here we go. He's just come back to like, you know, and it's like, well, no, each time I've come back, I've had less and less power, right? Like, you know, I've had less control each time I've come back and needed to, you know, do more politicking. And
it feels like it's progressive decentralization. It's not just a meme anymore. And you can actually show that line of having less power. The visualization I've got in my mind, I'm just going to try to paint a picture for listeners, is like a 2x2 matrix between, if you like, the x-axis is decentralization and the y-axis is market success. There's a trade-off here where like you aim for market success at certain times, and then you kind of ebb and flow back towards decentralization. You're like, oh wait, we're not getting decentralization and market success, so we need to turn back towards centralization and market success. And then once you succeed with that, you go back towards decentralization. You kind of zigzag across the matrix from not decentralized and not market success to decentralized and market success. Does that visual do anything for you?
It does, but I would tweak it just a little bit and say that as you get more market success, the things that were not previously concerning, like centralized aspects that were not previously concerning, become more concerning, right? So it's almost like you start off with something that's kind of centralized, and then if it gets successful, what was previously not concerning is now very concerning, right? There's like pressure to decentralize. And so then you're like, okay, well, let's decentralize this aspect. And that has this inevitable thing where sometimes, you go in the other direction, have less market success. And then you got to work out like, how do we, come back up and as you try and solve, because it's easier to do things if, we just build a database, right? Like, but then if you start out with a database and you're like in flight, trying to like remove bits of control or whatever, that's hard, right? And that can kind of lead to stagnation for a while. And I think we've seen that with Synthetix. As we've gotten more successful, we said, okay, let's change this thing. And then, things slow down for 6 months or whatever. And then eventually you find the new equilibrium and then it can kind of roll again.
Yeah, that's sort of interesting. So it's like the pressure builds to decentralize the more market success that you get. And so it's like, where is the stress coming from? Is it from a lack of market success or a lack of decentralization? And that's what causes you to turn along that switchback.
And I think we saw this like, globally, right? With DeFi, everything was run by multi-sigs everything was run by EOAs for a while, right? If
yeah.
We were honest with ourselves, right? There's just someone in the background signing all the transactions on a deployer account or something, right? And then, we were like, okay, guys, like that's not okay, right? Enough people shouted about it. And we said, all right, let's, replace that with multi-sigs, right? And then we're like, okay, let's replace the multi-sigs with like multi-sigs controlled by snapshot, right? And all of those things were kind of driven by pressure, where it's like, wow, DeFi actually is working. It's kind of cool. And people are like, this is not okay. You can't have this thing that's like got, billions of dollars of TVL and it's run by, a few multi-sigs. We need more, and so I think we've kind of seen that globally as well. And like each time you do that and you move away from just an EOA that's, one engineer that kind of controls everything, it can kind of quickly move. And now it's a multi-sig with 18 people on it and you can't coordinate them and, it slows down. Like that's just made it harder for us, right? And we need to find a new way then in this new paradigm of more decentralized, control. Okay, how do we progress there, right? And so, I think that's kind of been the global DeFi story on some level as well.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the global DeFi story, I think that you're in kind of a rarefied category with, I'd say, the other DeFi founders I really look up to are Rune and with Maker and Stani with Aave, Robert Leshner with Compound, and then Hayden from Uniswap. I'm wondering if you see any sort of, I think most famously Rune has decentralized himself from Maker and then come back with like a giant endgame plan and then tried to implement it. I'm not sure if I've seen the same thing from other DeFi founders, but have you learned anything from the way other founders in that cohort of upper echelon DeFi founders have decentralized and come back? And what are the similarities and differences between Synthetix's story and the other ones?
Yeah, like I would say I'm probably friends or at least acquaintances with all of those guys, right? So I've had conversations with multiple conversations with them. Some I'm closer than others. Hayden's interesting because he really has never stopped, right? Like he's the only one out of that group of people that you mentioned, I think, that's never really stopped, which is kind of crazy, right? It's a pretty impressive track record, starting from basically like early 2018, from the moment those contracts were deployed. I don't think he's gone anywhere. He's been like in the office every day for like 6 years. Nuts. So, which is, and I think maybe that's partially due to Uniswap feeling more like a normal startup.
Well, they've got Labs, which is like the startup he's the CEO of, and then the protocol is like there's like a firewall between them. I think it's the setup there. Yeah.
And I think that works well, right? Like maybe it's a little bit like more mentally sustainable or something like that. Like I still go back to like Larry Cermak's tweet back in like 2018 where it was like, I can't even imagine the stress that DeFi people are under, where like every day we had that tweet like on our wall for a long time, where it's just like every day is just pure chaos. And it's true. Like 2018, 2019, like every day we would wake up and be like, oh, is this the day we die, right? Like, is this the day where it all blows up? And, and then there were hacks and things would break and stuff. So it was incredibly stressful. And I would say, obviously Uniswap has had a lot of stress, but there's something about deploying immutable code and not upgrading it that probably, makes things a little bit easier. I think, I learned a lot from Robert and the way that they deployed their governance. This idea of like, basically allowing anyone to deploy new code and, having it as like this open pathway. It wasn't controlled by a deployer. I think that was one of the most innovative things that we sort of saw in terms of governance, over that like, pre-DeFi summer to DeFi summer period. That was pretty amazing. And what that I think allowed Robert to do was to kind of get out of the way in a similar way that to how I had, to say, okay, let's hand over governance and control of deployments to someone else so that I'm not sitting in the deployment pipeline. And that, that's something that I think is quite powerful. Rune and I, interestingly, had like a pretty fractious relationship starting off, right? Like I remember like sitting in like the DeFi, that first DeFi summit in 2018, like basically heckling him, right? Because he was talking about real world assets and like all of the stuff. And I was like, this is fucking insane, dude. Like, what are you talking about? So we didn't get along that well, but I think over time there's been like a mutual respect that's kind of grown. And I think he's probably the most similar to me in terms of like just really pulling back and saying like, let's see what happens. And then going, okay, cool. Here's my thoughts. I'll come back and try and, contribute again. So I think Rune and I are probably the most similar in that respect.
And then I think the last person in that cohort we didn't talk about is Stane and Aave, which, it's interesting to me that Stane is just going from like Aave being a huge success to like pushing on Web3 social would be my commentary on that. But I'm not familiar with the dynamics of his relationship with Aave at this point.
Yeah, it's funny. Like I'd say Stane and I are probably like the closest. Like I've known him the longest, and we've hung out a lot and like gone, like he's someone that I've like socialized with like quite a bit. And I have no idea what's going on with Lens. Like it's just really totally unclear to me like what the relationship is there. I would say he is unique. Even though I've kind of done angel investing and stuff like that, like I think he's the only one of all of those people, other than maybe Robert now, who's gone from like one large scale DeFi project to like trying to build another large scale project with like very high aspirations. It's pretty crazy. Like I couldn't do that. Like that is like, I needed some time off, like I couldn't just go from one thing to another. To be fair, I'd been doing startups for like 15 years before, Haven. So I was pretty burnt out even when I started it. But yeah, there's something pretty shocking about just being like, YOLO, I'm doing Lens now, right? Like I remember when I saw that, I was like, you're...
Yeah, well, once you've accumulated capital and talent, maybe you just see opportunities everywhere and you're uniquely positioned to pick them up. But
for sure. Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering, so why I wanted to do this episode is like, I think DeFi projects were one of the first things to reach product market fit and to feel, other than layer ones and things in that category, they're the first things to really feel this pressure to decentralize out of the founder CEO role. Maybe with the exception of all layer ones and layer twos, like things that are lower down the stack are feeling the pressure to decentralize, and for the founders, like the charismatic founder to check out. And my theory is that like as software eats the world, as software eats finance with Web3, there's going to be hundreds of other DAOs that have a similar sort of thing where you've got a charismatic founder that gets it off the ground. They're beloved, but also maybe they're like a little bit of a bull in the china shop. And so as they give away governance rights to the community, they decentralize. And maybe this episode is for them, for the ones who want to yo-yo back, but genuinely are committed to progressive decentralization over time. So, maybe the target audience for this right now is like, there's like 100 founders out there in 2023, but, hopefully as this grows over time, there'll be thousands of people. And I guess if you could speak to that audience, like what is your advice for someone who's either going to decentralize away from a project or is going to centralize back because you saw that the contributors, you gave them the power and now they're walking off the cliff with it. Like what have you learned that you would want the next people to go down this path to know?
So I think two things that I want to say to be like really transparent and honest, right? With, that group of people or just everyone, right? One thing is, as I was going through 2018 and 2019, I knew that we had to decentralize, right? I knew that that was critical for all kinds of reasons, right? And I wrote about it a lot, whatever. What was funny though is the people in my life who know me are like, what are you talking about? Like, I've never seen you give up power in anything. Like, if anything, you want more power, more control. Like, you really feel like you want to just drive things forward as much as possible. And I actually kind of psyops myself, right? As I was on podcasts, I was like, no, we need to decentralize. And I kind of convinced myself that I really wanted to do it. And so, that was a really interesting kind of realization I think I had late in 2019 of like, wait a second, this is actually not me. Like, it's what needed to happen, but it was not in my personality, but I somehow convinced myself that it was, right? And so that's one thing that I think maybe people who are startup people, right? And really driven, I'm guessing that would be a struggle a lot of people would have, right? And so, just calling out that like, this was not natural to me. Like, it wasn't my natural state to be like, let me give power to the world and give it up, right? I was probably more like a Zuckerberg style thing, but I somehow was able to like buy into the ethos enough and realize that this was critical enough that I psyops myself into thinking that I actually wanted it. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I think giving up power at the time when I first did in 2020 was a little bit self-serving as well, right? Because I was burned out.
Yeah.
Like,
so you're decentralizing stress with the decentralization.
Yeah, it was
of power.
like, I can't actually handle this stress. That's why, I look at Hayden and I'm like, that's amazing, right? He was able to do that for so long. But like, I really, I was genuinely burned out, and I felt like I was sort of incapable of contributing in the way that I wanted to. But, and this is the critical thing, right? If we had still been under like existential threat, right? Like existential startup risk, which most startups exist in for a really long time, right? Previously in like traditional startup world, you kind of live in existential stress until you get to a public company, right? Which was like 5 years, then 6 years, then 7 years, then 10 years. And so founders kind of got used to this idea that if you had a successful startup, you really had to get to public company status. And then you could kind of hand it over to the markets, and maybe a professional CEO comes in, or whatever, right? I felt like I was at a point where if we had still been under existential threat mode, like if we hadn't reached escape velocity and like had sufficient capital to survive, I would have kept going. I would have absolutely just kept grinding it out, but I didn't need to. We had gotten to a level of success and we had enough funding, and the treasury was sufficient that I could actually step back. And so it was a bit self-serving. It wasn't like, if you put a gun in my head and said, you need to keep doing this, otherwise the thing fails, I would have absolutely kept going. But it wouldn't have necessarily been at my full capacity, and I wouldn't have said that it would have been the best thing for my mental state or even the project or whatever, but I could have kept going. But I had the luxury of not keeping going. So there was an element of like, I needed to step back for my own sanity, and I did, and I could. And I think that's an important thing to recognize probably in a founder, that like, if you get to a point where you're sufficiently successful, you have the luxury of decentralizing, that might be the best time to do it, to take some time and see how the project goes. I think the other thing that I would say to founders is like, back in the day, 3 years ago, right? We didn't have the tooling. We didn't have Snapshot even. Like, we didn't have any tooling.
Right.
We didn't have DAO tooling. We didn't know what the hell we were doing. And so, today, handing over power to a community, there's a bit of a playbook. Which doesn't mean don't experiment. I think we should still be running experiments, and we by no means solve DAO governance, right? Like, we still have a lot of problems in DAO governance. And I really think that founders should have their own idea of what they think their project needs in terms of DAO governance and decentralization. And so those experiments are still important. But we're much better off than we were. And so the risk of handing over control of the community, I think, is far lower than it was back in the day. And so, I would say put all of those things together in your own mind as a founder and work out like, when is the right time to do this, and do it in a controlled fashion, and then be prepared to come back. Like, it might not be a one-time thing. You might need to come back and course correct.
Yeah, and I think there's agility in coming back multiple times and serving a different role in each of those times. I mean, I know that as a founder, my agility has been tested on multiple levels by just the number of things you need to be like above competence level at in order to be a viable founder. And going from being like a VP engineering to being a founder, and it has meant that you have to pick up a lot of things. But what I'm just impressed by is that you've come back 3 times, and each time you're doing something different and serving a different role, and being mindful of that and how you relate to people. It probably requires a lot of consciousness and agility.
Yeah, I think, there's a level of like, and I'm not saying I'm a humble person by any stretch, right? But like, there is a level of like existential, and like, just like sort of accepting that we don't know what we're doing. Like, at just like a global level, right? That like, we really don't know what we're doing, and to not get too caught up in it, and to not get so worried about trying to appear like, what's going on, right? And, so I would turn up and be like, this seems like it's not going well, but I would try to not be like super opinionated or like arrogant about it. Just try and like have like a sort of approach to the world of like, we don't know what's happening. Be humble about that.
One of the things that I've sort of seen is, having been in Web3 on 6 years now, I'm always struck by people who are sort of new to the ecosystem, whether they come from Web 2, where there's more of a playbook. Like in Web 2, you literally like, you acquire a user base, and you either turn on ads or you turn on a subscription model, and then you scale it so that cost of acquisition of a customer is lower than LTV. Then you turn on the marketing funnel and you sell to Google for $300 million. Like, that's the playbook. And then Web3, it's just there's no playbook, and the amount of uncertainty that you have to be comfortable with and still execute without having like 100% airtight plan. Like, I think that training people up on the ability to navigate that ambiguity is maybe one of the roles that you as a founder could play in one of these projects. And maybe that's only alpha while Web3 remains a Wild West. I'm sure it'll grow up over time. But I don't know if you have anything that you want to riff on there.
Yeah, I think that's very true. What's interesting to me, though, is that, I'm now watching Infinex kind of take shape, right? And there's a group of people that are working on it. I'm kind of helping and advising, I guess, right? Like, I'm not the founder of it in the sense of like day-to-day doing all of the stuff, right? There's, at the moment, like 5 or 6 people that are kind of contributors on that project. And I'm watching it take shape in a fashion that is very different to like what Haven was, or Synthetix was, or even some of the other projects that I've helped out with, or mentored, or whatever. And I think part of it is that we're getting closer to having a playbook, right? We're getting closer to like, these are known problems, and there's like a known solution, and you just need to like build the thing and go out and do it, right? And I do think that this will become easier for people over time. Like, it won't be as much uncertainty as we kind of dealt with in like 2016, 2017, 2018, whatever. So, I'm hopeful of that, and I'm kind of watching this in real time going, wow, like, these people are just putting together a pretty clear plan, and, the uncertainty around the plan there's a little bit of like uncertainty around like product and implementation details, but like, it's very small compared to like, is this even a thing that the world needs, right? Which is what we were kind of dealing with back in the day, right? Of like, did people even need stablecoin? Like, are stablecoins even a sensible thing to do? Is this, there were so many open questions.
Yeah, I feel that for sure. Although maybe working on regen Web3 and public goods, it still feels like a little bit out there. Like, people don't understand why the world needs this a little bit more.
I think you're still out there, right? Like, I think there's elements that are like a bit more understood. But public goods funding and all of that stuff, I think is still, there's a ton of uncertainty around it. So, I don't envy you there.
Yeah. Well, I think, there's a bunch of DAOs that have large treasuries that you can figure out how to allocate them, and their public goods, is I think figuring out how to build a decentralized ecosystem is, I think that's the next step for public goods funding, and having more crypto native path to reach that escape velocity, I think will be important if we're ever going to get to the dream state of having governments use protocols to allocate public goods. But, I'm at least starting to see the path, and maybe that's a function of just being there and synthesizing the vision, like you said, that only someone who's been around for a while can do.
And I think this is part of it as well, is like, it's only in hindsight, right? Like, it's only retrospectively that you can kind of even see the patterns, right? Yeah. People, that's one thing that I do get really frustrated with in the community, is people turn up and they're like, you guys are idiots. Like, why didn't you just do this thing or this thing or this thing, 3 years ago, right? And it's like, well, like on some level, that thing didn't exist, right? So someone needed to invent it, first of all, right? For us to even know to do it. And then also, we didn't even know what the shape of this, like, there was just like, it's hard to even communicate, I think, how little we understood what this stuff even did, right? Like even DeFi emerging as like a category was a bit of an accident, right? It was like 3 guys in a Telegram channel that were like, well, there's a bunch of money stuff going on. Like, what is that? And then like coming up with this, like, thankfully DeFi instead of open finance or whatever the options were. But like, it was like, okay, we didn't even have categories. We didn't have names for what we were doing. It's just we're doing some random stuff and it kind of coalesced into this thing, right? And so I think that when we look back, in 10 years or 20 years, we'll see the early glimmers of things that made sense. But the world will be using these tools in a very different way than we maybe expect or tried to build or whatever, right? And that's almost inevitable. But I think that ultimately it will make the world a better place. It's just that, it's going to take a lot of false starts and dead ends and, missteps to kind of get there and just keep experimenting, really.
Yeah, for sure. Well, having been in the trenches, I know that success is not always linear, and especially as a founder, a lot of times it's 1 step forward and 2 steps back for a long time until you catch a break. But that break can be one step forward that turns into 1,000 steps forward because you're just carried by momentum. And a lot of it is just going through the idea maze of trying stuff and not dying in the meantime. So it's quite interesting, but it's like that. It's like type 2 fun where it's like very stressful in the moment, but it's very fun when you're on the other side of it. And I'm just such an admirer of Synthetix and how you've come around the other side of it, and can't wait to see what you do with your third adventure here with Infinex in the moonshots.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, thank you. It's pretty exciting. It feels like I definitely feel a sense of like motivation and like excitement that has been missing for a while. Where like I'm actually like getting out of bed, like ready to be like, all right, what are we doing today? Like I'm excited about it. So that. And I think part of that excitement comes from like, I feel like we can actually go out and really make an impact. Like, even though we're building a trading interface, right? We've existed for the last 10 years of crypto, right? Of people trading in databases, which is just madness. When you think about like that, like that's just not, on some level it was inevitable and it couldn't have been any other way because we didn't have the tooling to do stuff with crypto in a crypto fashion, right? We had crypto, but we didn't have the tools to do crypto stuff with it. And so like now we finally do, and we're going to actually have this like phase shift from like using centralized tools to interact with crypto to using decentralized tools to interact with crypto. And even if that interaction is just trading and speculation, it's still better. And if we can get to that point and really make a big chip in this like centralized database driven reality that we've been operating in, that's huge. Like that's a next kind of, in my mind, like that's an inflection point for crypto. And, we've seen Uniswap and other people, kind of achieve some level of success with this, but there's still a long way to go. We need to, and I mean, even watching Base, right? Like watching Coinbase morph itself from this database reality to Base where they've got their own, chain. Like we're seeing that, we're starting to see it. So I think we're in an exciting phase right now in crypto.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I know that you're boomeranging back and maybe other people are boomeranging back right now, but I am wondering about the boomerang away from the project and what kind of, like, did you rediscover that you could have hobbies in that time? Like, how did you unwind from thinking about work and rediscover whatever it was that lights you up outside of work? Because I know that some people have told me they've had problems with that.
Yeah, look, I've talked about this a little bit. I definitely had some issues. I've struggled with addiction my whole life, and all of a sudden not having the addiction of work, right? Of, having a place to be every day where I had to like be functional, opened up some opportunities for me to just like let things go in a dark direction. And so I found myself, doing a lot of crazy stuff that was not healthy for me or my family, and it was definitely some hard times. I ended up going to rehab, and kind of now I'm sober and I don't drink or do drugs anymore or anything like that. And so it was a bit of a trade off of like all of a sudden I had time, and then my go to was like be chaotic in that time, right? Unfortunately, that's all I knew was just chaos and stress, right? And so when I didn't have stress in my life, I manufactured. But at the same time, I also was able to like take up, some hobbies that I hadn't had time for as much when I was like deep in startup reality, which, like freediving, for example, is something I absolutely love. And so I've spent a lot of time the last couple of years freediving, which has been amazing. So, it's definitely been trade-offs. Certainly the last year of being sober has allowed me to have a lot more time to do healthy things. It's been pretty great. So yeah, I'm feeling pretty good.
How long, when you're on the decentralization part of the yin yang, does it take you to stop thinking about work? Are we talking weeks or months?
Probably months, honestly.
Yeah.
It's definitely, it's something that you kind of need to wean yourself off. And like really, like, even those times where I did disappear, right? I was still in crypto. I was still doing transactions every day. I was yield farming and doing crazy stuff. So I never really got out of it. It was only the most recent time where I went to rehab and like really, got clean and like took time to like get my mental health in order, where I don't think I did an on-chain transaction. This is really funny, actually. So I didn't do an on-chain transaction for, I think, like 3 months, right? From like basically October of 2022 all the way through to like January, right? And then January, I'm back in Sydney. I'm like struggling to like be sober and like just live my life and everything. And I had to do a transaction. And I was like, okay, I got to go do a transaction. I plugged my Trezor in, got my computer ready to go. And I was like, oh, do I want to use Zapper or DBank? Because I wanted to go and like unwind some yield farm. And I was like, I'll use DBank. So I type in DBank in Google, and a like fake DBank link pops up. I click it, I go to this thing, and I literally am about to sign the transaction to like lose all of the funds in my like Kain.eth wallet, which at the time is probably a big chunk of money. And I was just about to like click sign transaction when I was like, wait a second, why am I signing a transaction? And I almost rugged myself. Like, so 3 months out of crypto. And so, I recommend keeping up with your OPSEC and not forgetting how to do crypto is probably important as well when you take a break. But yeah, that was the longest that I'd gone without doing any on-chain stuff or playing with weird yield farms and DeFi stuff.
Yeah, that's fun. Well, I think that this episode will serve as foundational subject matter for founders that have complicated relationships with their work and with their projects. And I know that I see some reflections of myself in the work that I've done in what you've done. So thanks so much for agreeing to do this episode. I'm wondering, as a final question, is there anything I didn't ask that you want to say?
No, I think we covered all the stuff in relation to governance that is off the top of my head important to talk about. I think it was pretty comprehensive. So hopefully it is valuable for people that are building stuff in space. Just to maybe even normalize some things. I think that's kind of a critical thing, right? Like, being one thing that I found when I did my mentorship program is that being a startup founder is very isolating oftentimes. Even you and I talk about this, right? And so I think that it is, even though, a lot of people in crypto and a lot of founders are very public and kind of on Twitter and like doing stuff, I don't know that they're, as open about some of the struggles that they have. And so I think that normalizing that, like, it is a struggle. Like, you're not the only one, right? Like, everyone's struggling, everyone's trying to figure things out, and not trying to pretend like you know everything or have, omnipotent or whatever. So hopefully that's kind of the final thing that I can leave everyone with. It's like, this is a struggle. It's really hard. The work that we're doing is difficult, and it can feel isolating, but there are people out there who are going through the same thing, and you just got to find your support network, basically.
Yeah, it can feel really lonely being a founder and isolating just to be in that seat. And I think just knowing other founders and comparing and contrasting struggles and having that support group is something that's valuable in and out. So I think that's a great place to end it.
Awesome.
Well, thanks so much, Kain. Really appreciated this.
Yeah, my pleasure. Good fun.
All right. Peace.
See ya.
All right, we just heard from Kain Warwick, the founder of Synthetix. I was really excited to talk to them to get into the nuance of decentralizing and re-centralizing yourself from a DAO or a DeFi project. For founders, I think that progressive decentralization is a great North Star and a great ideal. but I think that as a founder, it's really confusing to know what your relationship with your project could be. And just hearing from Kain and the struggles that he's had has, for me as a founder, helped me feel a little bit less lonely. So I hope that you enjoyed it as well. Thanks again for listening to the GreenPilled.network podcast. Again, we are building a coordination and network society of hackers, dreamers, and doers who are focused on using crypto to bring positive sum digital systems to the world. I think Kain is a shining example of this as a successful DeFi founder who's willing to pay forward his lessons that he's learned to the next generation of founders in the ecosystem. If you value this work, if you value the Green Pill Network, please subscribe, rate, and review. It really helps other listeners in the Web3 ecosystem to discover the work that we're doing to build more positive sum ventures in the world. So please subscribe, rate, and review. Peace and love. I will see you next time.